Our reflections on the book of Exodus. We have been with the people of Israel as they came into Egypt. We have been with them as God delivered them out of their bondage in Egypt, and we have been Egyptians, thinking about being Egyptians during that time. And today we're thinking about the wilderness. We're thinking about that time in which God delivered them to the promised land, which, had they followed the normal route, would have taken them 11 days. But instead, it took them over 40 years. If you look at Exodus chapter 13, verse 17, it's very clear that as God leads the people out of Egypt, that God specifically decides that 6440 to the West County is not the way they're going to go. It's not going to be fast. It's going to be slow. So let's just take a minute. The God who enabled the deliverance of the Egyptians to the promised land, of the people of Israel to the promised land, God who is capable of everything, even keeping any kind of military attack as they go up a fortified highway, decides that's not the route to the promised land. God directs the people of Israel back south and into the wilderness. 11 days becomes many, many years. Many years. I want to think with you about that. There's a book by Amira Zornberg that is specifically going into the story of the Exodus. And she says, if this were a movie, this would be the part where they ride off into the promised land. This would be the happy ending. This would be the moment where all of the conflict is resolved and things get good. But the Bible doesn't give us that kind of smooth, easy promise. The Bible takes God's people taken out of slavery and moves them right into a whole different kind of difficulty. And the difficulty quits being about what other people are doing to them, and it starts to be about what damage and growth and change needs to be happening inside of them. It becomes a time for them to move with God in faith into a whole different place, a wilderness. What is it about this wilderness that we need to learn from? There are 3 kinds of wilderness, and the one that they go into is probably the least familiar to us, this wilderness place. So why would God do that? They'd been 400 years in a very highly developed civilization. They had been 400 years at the bottom of a place that still kept them well fed. They had not had status, but they had food. They had not been able to pick what they wanted to do or choose where they wanted to live, but they had housing, and they had a place where they could celebrate their holidays intact. And yet now it was all gone. Why? Why does God let wildernesses happen? We've been in them, right? We've been in places that felt like a wilderness. By definition, a wilderness is those resources that we are used to and expect are gone. Those road maps that help guide us so we know how to get from point A to point B, they're gone. It's all way bigger than us. We start to feel out of control. Who are we in this new place? Have you felt that before? Have you been in that place? Yeah. It's scary. And yet God intentionally takes the chosen people, the people of Israel, and puts them in the wilderness right after they've had 400 years of being enslaved. What's going on? What's going on? So I said there's 3 kinds of wilderness. Probably one that you're familiar with is the wilderness of being exploited, the wilderness of being a stranger, the wilderness of not being able to thrive because of a context that you didn't choose. That one, God just pulled them out of. There's also the wilderness of that inner space, that grief or that moving into depression or anxiety, of mental health, of being overwhelmed because of a loss of a job or a place. That can be a wilderness. Moving into a new city when you haven't been there before can feel like a wilderness, but the literal space of wilderness is particular to what God wanted for the people. I don't know if you've read this book called The Solace of Fierce Places by Belden Lane, but he talks about the gifts wilderness gives us, and one of the little nuggets he says is we need the things that do not care about us, the places that do not care about us. He calls it the things that ignore us save us. Going to those places, being in those places reminds us we're not in charge. We are not in control. There is something greater than we are. So when the Israelites go into the wilderness, they ask 3 questions over and over again. Well, they say 3 things. What? What are you doing, God? Why are you doing, God? What is that stuff on the ground? That's the biggest one, right? What the manna is sort of the symbol of God's provision in a place they do not know where they're going to survive. But what did you bring us here for, to die? We could have died in Egypt. Why are you letting these things happen? Why are we being given bitter water? How are we going to make it? Ah, Egypt. Oh, if only we could go back to Egypt. You heard that in that little snippet. That's natural, isn't it? In those places where we've just gotten to that feel like we're overwhelmed, whether it's that moment before you knew and the moment after. All those reasons we wish we could rewind the clock. God knew they needed time to ask those questions. If it was 11 days to the promised land, there'd be a lot of work that wouldn't get done for the inner life and for the outer life. You know that song by America, I've been to the desert with the horse with no name. It's good to be. Okay, what's the last word in this? In the desert, you don't remember your, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain. Okay, so there's some truth in that. These people had been shepherds. They had come to Egypt 400 years. They had been nomads. They lived in Egypt 400 years. They had a name in Egypt, Apiru, slave, tasked people. People with no status except the fact that their labor enabled an economy. That was the name they had. They went to the desert. Nobody's looking at them saying, oh, you're one of them. Nobody was telling them who they were. They were suddenly given open space. And where did they have to look? Where we all have to look. Inward. Inward. They had been robbed of so many things, and God gave them the space to start looking inside. And, you know, if you live in a culture of dependence because all you do is work and they feed you, work and they feed you, and suddenly you're in a wilderness and there's no food, you got to figure out who you're going to depend on. You got to figure out who you're going to serve. And God says, I'm here. I didn't leave you. I'm going to make sure you have what you need to make it on this journey. And they say, great. And the next morning they forget. And they say, great. And the next morning they say, why are we here? I wish I was in Egypt. And over and over and over, God has to basically take out their own inner bondage and replace it with their sense of identity and trust and freedom in the God who created and called them for the promised land. That resonates for me, my friends. Does it resonate for you? I want to be that best self, but over and over and over, I'm wandering around forgetting all about it. Forgetting all about Jesus, who for me and for you shows us exactly what we're called to and how we're to live in this world. and repeatedly saying, it's okay. Keep following. Keep listening. We are on the way to the promised land. So I want to suggest to you that one of the things we can learn is how to live in the wilderness, how to be people who understand our identity as wilderness dwellers. Because in this life, I hope we make it to the promised land. I hope we see thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. But I'm not putting a whole lot of hope in that. My hope is not about what happens in my lifetime, what I can control, what I see. It's in Jesus. And that hope is real, and that promised land is real. We just might not all make it to see it through this life. We might be most likely walking through the door of death into it. But as we're walking toward that, who are we going to be? And I want to suggest to you that the best model is found in the wilderness, and it's being a drought-resistant plant. Jesus says those who are living in Christ are like a tree whose roots go down deep. That's a characteristic of a drought-resistant plant. They live in the wilderness. They grow their roots down deep enough to get every little bit of moisture. How are we growing our roots deep? How do we do it? Are we spending time not just on Sunday getting nurtured, but every day, finding ways that we receive that sense of the Spirit and the presence of God? It could be 5 minutes of deep breathing and centering on Jesus' name. Whatever it is, are we doing it? And then, the thing about drought-resistant plants is they don't become drought. They're, genetically, they're drought resistant, but the better they get better at it, the longer they experience the drought. They get practice, and that drought resistant becomes a part of their very capacity to continue to hold moisture. If they get a lot of rain at the beginning, they're not going to know what to do until the dryness comes. So we can think about this because we're all in a wilderness, or we're all headed to a wilderness. Those places of loss and uncertainty and lack of control are coming or they're going, and we're always with them. But we can continue to let them be formational for us, to let us be like those people of Israel, growing and changing. God was basically taking these people out of so much formation and letting them to go back to who they had been at the beginning, right? They were shepherds, they herded, they were nomadic, and now they were doing it again. Have you asked yourself, how is God leading me to be the person I was always meant to be, but the damage is still there? Because God is wanting that for us. And our drought resistance is in part about becoming whole, because we were meant to be drought resistant. We are meant to make it through this life and our own suffering and still have victory. And the other thing, last one, drought resistant plants have fruit. They have seeds. They have the capacity not only to make it through for themselves, but for all the other creatures around them that are suffering. So it's not just about us. God called the people of Israel to be a blessing to the nations, and we're standing in that blessing. We're standing in that legacy of generosity and faithfulness, and that's a part of who we are, and that's what we are called to be for each other. What a privilege. What a privilege to know our suffering is not meaningless. Our wilderness is not gratuitous. It's not random. It's not simply some caprice of a chaotic world. It is an opportunity for us to draw close to God, to look up and see that we are being led by a God who hears not just our cries, even our complaining, and cares and loves us. And may we also be people who follow God and walk in that in confidence that every single step we are on our way to the promised land.